Welcome back, everyone, to our second panel on collaborating across different disciplines. Thanks for coming here, and thank you to our really awesome group of panelists for agreeing to speak with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A rather than into the chat. I know it's a little different than what we've been doing for the talks. And me and Heather will be moderating this panel and sort of, getting questions into the panelists. So to start us off, maybe we could have all of the panelists go around and tell us a little bit about ourselves, starting with Chad because he's first on my screen.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me to be on this panel, and thanks to those of you who are attending. I'm Chad Topaz. I'm an applied mathematician at Williams College, which is a small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. And I'm also the co-founder and executive director of research of QSide, which is Institute for the Quantitative Study of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. Is that what I'm supposed to say, Michelle?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
Shelby?
Apparently, I need to learn how to hold down my spacebar for the right amount of time to unmute myself. Anyway, I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me, especially because I'm still a graduate student. So I'm an in-stage PhD candidate, defending this semester in ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, but I'm also concurrently getting a master's in statistics. But the majority of my work focuses on using quantitative methods to look at gun crime in Chicago and how it spreads throughout the city.
Awesome, thanks. Nancy?
Hi, everybody. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you for the organizers for putting together this panel. I'm excited to be part of it. So my name is Nancy Rodríguez, and I am an assistant professor in the Applied Mathematics Department at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'm, generally interested in studying spatial temporal dynamics from the macroscopic perspective of, systems in the social sciences, ecology, economics, more recently, through the lens mainly of partial differential equations, but also through like metapopulation models.
Great, and Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be with you today. My name is Jennifer Victor. I am an associate professor of political science at George Mason University in the Schar School of Policy and Government in Fairfax, Virginia. And my area of interest and research focuses on American politics, particularly legislative politics. My research looks at the various types of relationships that exist between members of Congress and all sorts of people that interact with members of Congress, including campaign donors and lobbyists and extra party members and so forth, and how those various relationships contribute to the propensity that they have to come to agreement on things. So my area, my work really, looks at everything from political parties to campaign finance and all sorts of other things that are pretty much broken in the United States right now. So there are lots of interesting projects and lots of interesting applications in thinking about both on the theoretical and the empirical side about how networks interplay in politics, which is where my passions lie. So very happy to be with you all.
All right, thanks for those nice introductions. While we're waiting for questions to pile in from our lovely audience, and again, don't forget to put those into the Q&A as soon as you think of them. I would like to actually have each of our panelists just briefly tell me what's one piece of advice that you would have for somebody who's interested in getting involved in more interdisciplinary collaborations. And maybe this time we'll start with Shelby.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my one piece of advice is to be bold. If you see someone on Twitter who is posting really interesting things, reach out to them, email them. If you see someone's work who you admire, email them. If you run into somebody at a conference, go up and talk to them. It can be intimidating, especially as a graduate student, to speak to people who you see as authority figures, but I think it's really important to just be bold, send those cold emails. The likely worst response you're going to get is no response. No one's going to take time out of their busy day to say, why the heck would you even email me? So be bold and don't be afraid to go far outside of your field.
I might add to that something about the sort of sharing and talking a lot with others about the importance of various types of collaborations. Particularly in my field, there's a fair amount of sort of peer pressure or academic pressure to engage in solo authored publications and to really demonstrate your contributions to a field with your own effort and your own work. And sometimes the incentives that we have to do that type of solo work really impedes our ability to get more creative and outside of our comfort zones and do more interdisciplinary type work. And so to me, one of the best ways we can push back against those types of incentives is to just literally do it more. And the more we recognize how much you know, other scholars in other fields and you know, things that are outside of maybe our primary channel can be really valuable for helping us to think through problems and bring creative solutions to different types of things, I think is really helpful. So just talking about it and doing it as much as possible will, I think, to some extent help break down some of those norms in some subfields towards that might be anti interdisciplinarity.
For me, I would say that what I've learned is to be patient. So we speak different languages, right? As mathematicians, and you're working with someone who's an expert in the field that, you know, of the specific topic that you're studying. And it could take a long time for you to actually come to an agreement, right, on what your tools can address based on the very complex systems that they're trying to analyze. So I've always found that, you know, the social scientists, the economists have these very complex systems and questions that they want to analyze, and the tools that I can provide can sort of shed some light into it. And it's difficult to get that across sometimes. And it just takes, you know, a lot of patience, a lot of listening from your part, trying to understand sort of really what would be interesting to them, and just, you know, sort of a cycle of you thinking about ideas and discussing it with them. And so I think that the hardest part for me has always been getting to that point where I can say, okay, I can start really working on the model, doing the analysis. You know, I've been to conferences with Shelby and Heather where, you know, we're there for a week and there was no mathematical equation written at the end of the day, right? But we listened to the experts. And so I think at the end of the day that from the mathematician's point of view, you know, just be patient and listen, right? And try to learn before you sort of, you know, try to shove your tools, you know, to your collaborators.
And really what I'll say just kind of adds or reiterates what Shelby and Jennifer and Nancy have already said. For me, you know, there's a difference between doing research alongside someone in a different discipline and doing research with that person across disciplines. And the most rewarding collaborations I've had across disciplines are the ones where I have put in the effort to actually like learn something substantive about criminal justice or art history or whatever is the topic that I'm working on. And honestly, as much as I love doing math, it turns out I love being able to understand the world through those other lenses as well. So I think, yeah, like, you know, providing what we can provide as quantitative thinkers and mathematicians is fantastic. And so is like going even a step beyond that to try to step into the other scholars' worlds as much as we're able to.
So sort of continuing off this thread of like learning from your collaborators, what is your thinking on how much and what parts of the field of your collaborator you should try to learn as opposed to just trusting their conclusions? And maybe we can start with Nancy, since she sort of addressed some of this already.
Well, I've tended to sort of trust, you know, basically we're starting, you know, I'm developing models, right, to try to understand certain questions. And we're always starting with certain assumptions, right? And so I basically just work from the assumptions that, you know, I do also read articles in the field. But for the most part, I think of my collaborators as the people who, whose assumptions, they're going to be driving the assumptions that I work with in my model. I think I agree with Chad. It's rewarding to learn and just for you to know more about the topic. But at the same time, we do have a limited amount of time. And so this is the reason why we talk to the experts, right? To make sure that we are not making up these assumptions because they're mathematically convenient.
I would agree with that. And, a collaboration is a relationship at the forefront. And so, it was mentioned yesterday during the panel, but there is a level of trust, and then there are also expectations. And so as you're looking for these, collaborations, you can look back and read someone's past work, but also in conversations with them, say, listen, this is how much of the subject information, I need for you to give me, and here's how much of my subject information I'm going to give you, and have an open communication where, as Nancy said, if you have a question about an assumption, you can ask that outright. And if they want to know exactly how your model works, you're willing to present that to them.
I think I appreciate Nancy's focus on assumptions. I think that's absolutely the right way to think about it, because ultimately when you're working with somebody from another field, to me, one of the valuable parts about working with collaborators is not much different than the valuable part about teaching. It forces you to articulate concepts to an audience that doesn't necessarily already speak your language. And so that careful process of going through and thinking about what are my assumptions and how do I explain this to somebody who doesn't already think about this or use the same words to describe it as I do is helpful for me. I mean, it forces me to understand my own stuff better, and then forces me to make sure that the assumptions we are using in whatever work we're doing are in fact appropriate. And so in that way, I think that the communication that goes, like the more communication there is, allows you to clarify what those assumptions are and to make sure everybody's on the same page, that they are reasonable, and that whatever work people are doing off in their silos is consistent with those assumptions, that it all holds.
That's fantastic. So our next question, I think we have a lot of mathematicians in the audience who are particularly excited to hear a little bit more about your work, Jennifer. And the question that has risen to the top here is, can you discuss a few of the areas of mathematics that your research and work has intersected with? And the question asker highlights a few options, possibly game theory, dynamics, machine learning, things for congressional transcripts, et cetera. So if you could jump off and tell our mathematicians in the audience a little bit more about that, I think they'd like to hear it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I mean, there's a lot of exciting areas that political science is going these days that intersect with math and data science and so forth. In my own work, I had some training in game theory in my graduate days and some early papers in that area, but I haven't used much formal modeling in my published research since then. Formal modeling really has become it's more of a niche field in political science, or subfield in political science, and is not, in some ways, not as well integrated into the rest of the discipline. A lot of the theorizing that goes on in political science outside of formal theory is of the more substantive, almost qualitative or variety, and some of it, of course, is normative, but the normative theory doesn't intersect with the math and stats all that much. In my own work, I guess the two main veins, one is just in sort of traditional econometrics and statistical analyses, panel data and hierarchical models and, various forms of variance of regression analyses is a lot of some of the work that I've done. And then the other main vein is in networks. So about, 12 years ago, I got exposed to the whole field of social network analysis. It was one of those things where back in like 2005, I was doing some research on Capitol Hill, and I had all of this very quantitative, very like econometrics kind of driven training in political science. And I'm on Capitol Hill observing all of these things happen, and I didn't have a framework for understanding it because there were so many little relationships going on between political actors. Like the office that I was in was co-sponsoring a bill with this other office, and it seemed to me the only reason that was happening is because the chiefs of staff used to date each other, or weird things like that. And I just didn't know what to do with it at the time. Like I didn't have a framework for understanding it. And then in 2008, James Fowler and David Lazar started this political networks conference and workshops at Harvard. And I just got sucked in and I drank all the Kool-Aid. And, that was after all of my graduate training, but got as up to speed as I could on both the sociology side of the theory of networks, but then also on the more mathematical applied side. And that was when ERGM models were sort of just coming out and just starting to get applied to political questions. And so sort of been following the field and been a part of the political networks field ever since then. So a combination of both of those main veins of applied math and stats is where a lot of my work has been. And I'm happy to take follow-up questions. I just don't really know where people want to go.
So sort of touching on that, how easy is it to move between disciplines as your interests change over time? I think anyone can take this question.
I would say that it's very risky because, especially if you're in a tenure track position and you're on a clock to get publications done, if you've done your initial research in a particular subfield or under, a particular sort of set of, like publication expectations and so forth. And then you just change fields, it's getting into a whole new set of reviewers with different kinds of standards and norms and models that you might be less familiar with. And it can be really risky. So having a extensive set of mentors to help you do that and to guide you through and to sort of pre-review papers for you or whatever else can be super helpful.
I completely agree with Jennifer. I think it's risky and exciting, like any number of risky things. So, I mean, I would say I've switched the focus of what I do any number of times in the last 20 years. I mean, when I started in graduate school, I was sort of like more of a low dimensional dynamical systems person. And then when I was a postdoc, I was sort of a little more applied analysis-y, and I did a lot of biological modeling. And then at some point I got involved in topological data analysis. And then at some point I just sort of became very focused on data science. And so like mathematically, I'm using all these different tools, but in terms of areas of application, I sort of moved from like fluid dynamics to chemistry to biology to social justice. So like it's been like this very sort of drastic, but I guess over a long span of time, but it's been, quite a change to go from working on, fluid dynamics to now like reading law papers to help me do my work. And it is risky. And every time you change, it does involve like a certain amount of rebuilding, sort of. There's this like rebuilding phase. So there is the risk. I also really enjoy that part of it. I mean, for me, it's part of the joy is like learning something new from the ground up.
Yeah, I would say that it's also hard. I know my research covers a lot of applications, but sort of under the broad, same broad mathematical tool. And I've been moving a little bit towards incorporating more data, but inevitably, the pressure to publish the papers and use the techniques that you already know, and also I find that every time I try to move away from a topic, I'm sort of dragged back in it because of my historical, just being present in that the people that know me, their collaborations that keep coming up. And so it's sometimes difficult to actually leave certain areas. But I would say that if you are interested in moving, you could also do it gradually, right? You don't have to make a huge leap, but rather, start learning the topic, say, okay, well, I'm going to maybe spend, sometime in the summer to start learning this topic. I'll start going to these conferences. but still devote, still have time to do the things that you're going to be able to get published, so that you're meeting all the milestones and your career is progressing, but you're also, learning new tools. So I think that, that's one way where you can minimize the risk in sort of transitioning.
So go ahead, Shelby. Or maybe I'll ask this question that's on a related note, and I'm going to pass it to Shelby first. So since you all are talking about the dangers and pitfalls and challenges of switching to different interdisciplinary fields, what's the thing that got you all interested in interdisciplinary type work, or what was your first interdisciplinary project? Like, what is the thing that that made you make that leap? And Shelby, I'm going to have you start.
So I'm going to shout out my undergraduate mentors. So Erin Bodine and Rachel Jabali at Rhodes College. Well, Dr. Jabali is now at Colorado College. And then also Carrie Diaz-Eaton, who was at my very first conference I went to when I was 19 and, took me under her wing as, a little bit of an academic niece. I had some amazing role models show me that interdisciplinary work was a thing. I went into my undergraduate career thinking that math was very much, cut and dry, that the maximum thing that you could do with it was calculus, and then was kind of pulled out through the small liberal arts world and brought into applied mathematics. And my very first project was tuberculosis modeling. And I was pre-med at the time, and then I got to see kind of how mathematics could be applied to different diseases, and I just immediately fell in love. And then was pulled into an REU from that, and then just continued on. I think the biggest thing for me was realizing that every system that you come into contact with can be modeled in some way, shape, or form. And so it completely changed my worldview to know that math can be applied to this wide variety of systems.
Okay, I was waiting for someone else to say something, but I'll just say something quick, which is I'll just tell you my bookends. So my bookends were that when I was a PhD student, I was supported by my department's NSF interdisciplinary training grant. So what my graduate training was to be able to collaborate with an experimental physicist who was studying fluids problems. So that is sort of how I was trained from the start. That was the start of the story. But the end of the story, in terms of why I work on using mathematics to solve and model and study issues in social justice, that's the thing that I care about and the most in the world. And I used to think that these were two separate parts of my life. Like I did math and then I did social justice work. And then at some point I realized I could use math to do social justice work. And so that is where I've ended up.
Okay, so sort of continuing along the trend of how to actually get interdisciplinary work done, or what some of these projects look like, where do you find the fora for presenting projects that are math and criminal justice, or math and political science, or other kinds of interdisciplinary works that don't have obvious forums for presentation?
I want to answer this question, but come at it at a slightly different angle, which is to say that in my experience, these collaborations are either sort of demand driven or supply driven. So either they're happening because I have a question in mind that I just need help with, right? Like I can't actually gather this data and get it into the form that I want, or develop the appropriate model for it, or whatever it is. And having collaborators that have more experience in whatever area it is just helpful and makes the project go much better. And that's just sort of like a demand-driven kind of collaboration that occurs. And when that happens, that would normally be me taking that kind of work to my regular sort of outlets that I would take it to at political science conferences, or whether they're big conferences or more specialized ones. But then the other version of this is more sort of supply-driven, which is somebody approaches me or I hear about a particular call for proposals or a funding opportunity or something like that, where it's like, oh, this is interesting, and I think maybe I have something to say about this, but certainly not on my own, or maybe it's even designed to be interdisciplinary, and either somebody approaches me or I try to put a team together of people from other fields in response to a particular thing that I didn't come up with in the first place type thing. And so those, I think, how those get disseminated have a lot more to do with who I wind up working with, or where the funding had, or the RFP or whatever had come from, that might take me into venues that are much less familiar.
I would also say that, if you're doing interdisciplinary work, you can always present in any one of the specific conferences, right? You just have to sort of make sure you focus, your presentation and use the language that field uses, right? And so I think, sometimes what happens with me is that we will publish a paper in a more mathy journal, and then one where it's, more ecology, less of the math. And so you can present in both types of conferences and just sort of maybe don't show the technical details as much and focus on sort of the outputs and what you've learned, right, from the mathematical model, or a math conference. I would say that, any applied math conference that you sort of, usually go to, it's a perfectly good venue to share any of your interdisciplinary work.
Can I just amplify something Nancy said that I really loved, which is that I think when you do what Nancy's talking about, which is like, be aware of your audience and talk to different audiences in appropriate ways, you're taking the thing that you do, which is collaborating across disciplines, and essentially like teaching other people how to do it. Like you're walking into a room and getting like a bunch of mathematicians excited about a social system, or getting a bunch of, sociologists excited about like your mathematical approach, even if you're not showing all of the details, right? So, I mean, I think that what you've described, Nancy, is like a super powerful way to approach it.
A related question has come up in our Q&A, which is it difficult to stay up to date with the current research when you're working in multiple fields? So for example, keeping up with current research on the mathematical side while you're working in other disciplines and trying to learn about other fields. And do you have any tips for balancing your time when working in different fields? And I'm going to leave it open to whoever's ready to jump in.
So something that I use is I have Google Alerts set for, Google Scholar alerts set for all of my kind of subfields. And so then, every now and then, or I guess once a week is what I have it set to, I get a list of here's all of the stuff that's been published with those keywords in the last week. And so I can just run through that and be like, oh, that is a really interesting paper. And I have an organizational system. I think Al posted my, literature from the gun violence workshop in the Slack yesterday. And so that's kind of my system of keeping track. And then I do have a thing on there of whether I've read it or not. I don't get to every paper, but if I have listed, what's the major question? What's the major conclusion? What method are they using? When I'm, looking through my literature, trying to find a source, I can look through that and be like, oh, right, there is that source right there. I do need to go back and read this paper because it is important. I don't think it's possible to stay up to date on every single subfield that you focus on. But being able to at least know what has been published most recently and pull the things that catch your eye. Again, follow the people who publish in your field on Google Scholar, on Twitter, and then you do kind of get the summaries of what's happening.
Okay, so that's super helpful advice, by the way, Shelby. That's a great idea. I should probably do that. But switching sort of tracks a little bit, in the past, I've heard that interdisciplinary work makes it difficult to get tenure, as colleagues in the department are not able to assess its quality to the extent that it involves a discipline with which they are not familiar. Have you encountered such challenges, and how have you addressed them?
Yeah, I think this relates to some of the risk that Chad and I were talking about earlier with the idea of sometimes shifting a focus disciplinarily. And while there is some risk involved, I also think that there are ways to help a department or whoever your reviewers are going to be. You have to teach them how to process what you've contributed, right? So it's not just about, here's my list of publications and the different people that I've worked with across these different fields, but here's the research program, or here's the big driving questions, and give people a framework and a narrative for understanding where the work is and how it's contributing and what your specific role has been in these cross-disciplinary adventures. Because at the end of the day, I think people who get worked up about being, concerned that interdisciplinary collaborative work is somehow less desirable for an academic, or people should get less, it should count less towards tenure or something like that. At the end of the day, what they're worried about is that they can't evaluate how each person contributed to the project. And so just explain that, like whether that's done in a more qualitative or a more quantitative way, like whatever way that you can explain what each person's, particularly your own contribution, has been. The way that files get put together and information gets shared within departments or whatnot, there's lots of opportunities to make that happen. And so there's a little bit more effort that has to go into sort of lobbying for that type of contribution on your behalf, but I think it's doable in most places, unless you're just at a place that's going to be adversarial to that type of thing, in which case, maybe a different strategy.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jennifer, because I also advise people, like, if you're going into a job, to, when you're interviewing for a job or considering accepting a job offer, to sort of suss this out, right? Because it's one thing for a school to tell you, like, oh, like, great interdisciplinary work. And like, it's another thing to get into the nuts and bolts of like how you're actually going to be evaluated. And so asking those kinds of questions at job search and hiring time, I think, is like really important. Like, how does your evaluation process work, like tangibly, operationally? And that might like tell you something about, your likelihood of your work being accepted by that system. I mean, also, I should just own like my privilege in answering this question, which is like, I didn't start doing all the crazy stuff I do now until after tenure. And that wasn't like a plan, like, oh, I'm going to get tenure and then like start working on all my crazy social justice stuff. That's just like what happened, right? Like I worked on things that were pretty like bread and butter applied math domains. Like I was doing biology and chemistry and physics. Like it was all like well within the natural sciences. It was like mostly being published in applied math journals. So like I'm just owning, like, I didn't have that barrier to face. I think if I were going up for tenure with the work that I've done in the past like 4 years, it would be like a very different story. And I would be worrying about how I was going to handle that. Not worry, I would be strategizing about how I was going to handle that.
Chad is absolutely right about that. I just want to add that if you're on a job interview or something like that, and you're trying to suss out how welcoming an institution is towards interdisciplinary work, you don't ask the dean or the provost. I mean, you can, but they're all going to say yes. Like, I haven't met an associate provost, like an associate provost or dean that is against interdisciplinary work. Like, that is not a creature that exists in the natural world. So what you need to do is ask the junior people or even the graduate students, or like really get a feel for on the ground how, like, ask questions about the most recent files that went through tenure or how those cases went, or I don't know. You ask the same question over and over to lots of different people at different levels, and you're more likely to get the honest answer on this question to the people at the lower levels, I think, in my opinion.
I'll speak to kind of the graduate student experience with this, because I, at some point, had to decide, am I going to take the courses that make me well suited to be in a biology department? Am I going to take the courses that make me well suited to be in a math department, in a statistics department? And I ultimately decided to take a wide variety of courses, and therefore likely am going to move out of academia I'll still be around. Y'all aren't getting rid of me that fast, but I decided that I would rather, take some criminal justice things, some ecology things, some math things, some stats things, but in some ways that serves as a barrier to me being directly in an academic department. And that's not to say that those jobs are not out there, but I think that it has been difficult for me to see, very specific calls that say that they're interdisciplinary, but be somewhat aware that I may not have the background necessary to serve in that position because I don't have a hefty enough math background to serve in a math department.
And let me, I guess, I'm going up for tenure this year, so I'm thinking, right, I'm putting together my my committee, and it is, I mean, I'm in an applied math department, so interdisciplinary work is definitely valued, but we all have very different fields of application, and so it is difficult. It can be difficult to put a committee together, but at the end of the day, people who understand, if you're in a math department, right, the mathematical techniques, who know the journals that you publish in, and they're going to rely a lot on research letters anyway. So I would say for the most part, the people who are writing your letters know your work, and that's going to inform the committee significantly, right? So I think that that shouldn't sort of keep you from pursuing interdisciplinary work. I think if you're in a department that wants to see you succeed, which I hope that we are all hired into departments that want to see us succeed, then they're gonna sort it out. And no, as long as you're gonna be honest about the work that you do, they're hiring you. They want you to keep doing that. Now, switching in between, you're gonna have to sort of feel your department and see how they would appreciate that. But I would say that if they're going to rely on the research letter, so if they want to make it work, they're going to figure out whether your research is high quality and what journals are good. That's something that they can figure out.
Yeah, this has been a great discussion for those of us who are thinking about tenure for sure. And so now I want to address a question that is touching on a different perspective, a different end of the spectrum. And this question says, I enjoy mathematics, but not academia, and so I'm dissuaded from going into graduate school. Have you ever worked with mathematicians who don't have graduate level training? Has it really mattered? And how do those experiences compare? And maybe I'll get Shelby to start off since she was giving us a graduate student experience.
So working with mathematicians who do not have graduate degrees in math, is that the question?
So the question is, I think some of it is working with people who don't have graduate degrees, but I think that another part of it is maybe thinking about going to grad school or perhaps looking for opportunities outside of grad school.
Yes, so there are a lot of opportunities outside of graduate school. Graduate school is wonderful. It's not for everyone. And that could be due to the types of positions that you're looking for. That could be due to just the fact that research is not something that sparks your passion, which is completely okay. I got a piece of advice when I was already in graduate school that I wish I had gotten as an undergrad, which is to come up with 10 dream jobs of where you'd like to be in like 15 years even. Write down the qualifications for those dream jobs. They don't have to be things you're currently working towards, just some dream jobs, and then see what's in common. If none of those require a graduate degree, there's no purpose in going to grad school. If all of them require a PhD, you should probably go and get a PhD. If 6 of them require SQL experience, take some seminars on SQL. And so it's just a way to kind of think about where do you want to be in the long term, and then what are the steps that you need to take in order to get there. So yeah, that's my thoughts on graduate school. But there are so many things that you can do with a love for mathematics that do not require graduate school.
I heard a slightly different thing in that question, which I wondered if I don't know if the questioner intended or not, but I heard it a little bit more as if I go to graduate school, but I don't want to be an academic, is that okay? To think about non-academic pursuits or jobs after graduate school. And I think that given the pandemic, given the downturn in the economy, given the fundamental changes that higher education is now and will continue to go through, there's just going to be this terrible slog in the academic job market for years. The academic job market is already moves slow and is behind times, and so it's not going to be great for a while. Apologies if I'm depressing anybody who's about to be on the market. But with that in mind, thinking about, for people who are thinking about, should I go to graduate school and will that tie me to this terrible job market that I don't want to have to try to compete in? I think it means that there will be just sort of by force, lots of opportunities for people with higher degrees in some of these applied fields to do non-academic work. I certainly think it's true in political science. I don't have a great amount of experience with it, but I do think there are lots of opportunities at research institutes and think tanks and lobbying firms and all sorts of different kinds of opportunities out there in private industry for people who have PhDs to go and do applied non-academic work out in different kinds of industries. So just because you don't want to be an academic doesn't necessarily mean, like, I don't think that's the criteria you should definitely use for going down that road. I should add, that said, that once you have the PhD, you're now overqualified for 99% of the jobs out there. So it does limit what you might be able to do in the future. So, you still have to weigh it.
Yeah, as someone currently on the job market, I'm going to second that. It's like, master's preferred. And I'm like, well, gonna click that one out of the tab.
So I think I'm going to sort of highlight the second part of that question and combine it with another question, which is about like working with mathematicians of different kinds of backgrounds. So first of all, I guess, like, if anyone wants to speak to working with mathematicians that don't have a graduate education, please do. But also on top of that, how often do you work with mathematicians who are more in the pure or theoretical fields, and what are those experiences like? Does it matter whether the mathematician has applied or pure training?
For me, I just think it matters if they're like a congenial, open-minded person who likes to communicate. You know what I mean? Like I got involved in topological data analysis like a few years ago, despite having never taken a course in topology, graduate or undergraduate ever. And like, I had the good fortune to like find myself in a room sometimes with like really awesome topologists who come from the pure math topology community, who wanted to tell me stuff and talk about things and like see if there was common ground. And now I use topological data analysis in like, in social justice problems sometimes, right? So yes, I mean, I found it extremely rewarding. And again, for me, it's less about like the disciplinary or subdisciplinary dichotomy, and it's more just about like finding who your people are. At least that for me, that's what it's about.
Okay, let's follow up with a related one. In general, do you find there's any pattern or likelihood to who initiates the collaborations, the mathy side or an application domain side, or are many projects emergent from mutual collegial conversations as Chad is discussing?
I would say that for me, most of my collaborations have come out of, I go and I present my work and someone, hears me talk and they reach out to me, or I go and I hear a talk and I say, oh, I could really use that technique, or I really like that application. And so I think it's mostly out of just listening, just sharing your research and your passions and listening to other people. And then, not being afraid to sort of talk. But I haven't seen a pattern of, the math or the application side driving. It's just, pretty much like every conference that I go to, at least some sort of idea comes out of that from either listening to a talk or listening to someone who heard me give a talk. So I really encourage everybody to attend conferences, attend talks, and ask questions and talk to people, because that's how your career is going to move forward.
I want to plus one what Nancy just said and emphasize that I think this might be one of the chronic conditions that is a lasting effect of the pandemic in academia that I think we should be aware of, because the lack of connection and the lack of ability to attend conferences and all of that is getting compounded because of the pandemic, and it is differentially affecting populations, so that people of color and people who come from institutions that are less advantaged or less plugged in are going to feel the consequences and effects of that lack of connection and lack of ability to attend conferences more so than people who are come from more positions of privilege. And I don't know what to do about that at this point, except to recognize it and to be aware. And when, the mathematicians invite the political scientists to come and participate in their math panel, like, say yes, right? I've never met anybody here before, but I've seen some of your names, and, I'm interested in what you do, and I'm tickled that you're interested in what I do. And that's all good, right? And it's way harder to make these kinds of connections across disciplines. I mean, I see it in my own classroom, right? Like, I got through the fall semester pretty well, but the one thing that I did not master or figure out how to wonk is to connect with my students. Like, I don't know any of them. I don't even know what they look like. They don't turn their cameras on. And they seem to be okay with that. And most of the time I was okay with that, but it's a huge missing link in the educational experience. And that just bleeds over into all the other parts of what we all do in terms of research production in ways that I think are costly and will continue to be costly even as we get past the pandemic.
Okay, so sort of continuing on this question of like how collaborations start and change over time. How often do collaborations lead to both interesting mathematical questions and interesting questions in other fields? Do your collaborations often start with one type of question and then lead into another?
I mean, my collaborations almost never end with the question they started with. I mean, just to be honest about that, yeah. But in terms of being driven by one or the other, I mean, at this point, like for me, because I am very social justice focused, like that's the thing that's driving the projects I work on. And then it's like the mathematical techniques that get pulled out or whatever techniques need to get pulled out. Occasionally, in these recent projects I've been doing, I might be pushing a couple of mathematical boundaries, but not many. I'm mostly using like some relatively well-established things to try to like answer questions in a domain area. Yeah.
I would say probably that's sort of, personal to, your interest, right? So for me, up until now, I'm interested in questions that are both, that can shed light into some complex system, but also that is interesting mathematically. And that's just because I find myself just the problems that I'm more interested in are, where I'm trying to understand them from the mathematical perspective. I can't just use a tool that has been developed. And so, I do think that there are many problems where you can push both, right? Where whatever model you develop is, sort of, and the questions that you ask are sort of motivated by the application. You then learn something, and that can maybe lead to another question. And so I do think it's possible, and it just sort of depends on the project and depends on your interest and your collaborators' interest.
Okay, thank you. So then I think this might be one of our close to last questions because we're starting to run out of time, but moving tracks to kind of like pedagogy rather than just research. Do any of you collaborate across disciplines in your teaching as well as your research? And what does that look like?
So I have not been deeply in the teaching world personally, but I am the communications officer for the Society for Mathematical Biology Education subgroup. And so I've spent a lot of time listening to talks and speaking with people who are in the mathematical biology teaching world. I also have a paper on using different technological tools to teach quantitative biology. And so I think there is a lot out there in teaching across those two disciplines. I can't necessarily speak as much to, maybe teaching quantitative political science or anything like that. But between mathematics and biology, there is a fair bit of synergy out there. I'll also plug Cubes Hub, which is a quantitative biology education resource. If any of you are looking for places to start in teaching quantitative biology. They have a bunch of online modules, and so you don't have to start from scratch when developing your curriculum.
I would add that I think that opportunities to teach research methods, like social science research methods, are fantastic places to engage in all sorts of interdisciplinarity. And the few opportunities that I've had in my career to work with, usually it's other political scientists who are just from other subfields, but where we work on a project together where we for example, a colleague of mine had a State Department grant to go teach social science research methods and applied stats in the Republic of Georgia. And so a group of us traveled to Tbilisi and worked with students there who had some English skills, but we taught them stats and we taught them R and we taught them social science research design. And doing it in a team teaching setting with those colleagues was hugely rewarding because I got to watch how they teach these concepts that helped inform my own teaching and the way that I think about these things. We just picked up so many great tips and tricks from one another and watching one another teach. And sort of feeding off one another, that it really turned into a great experience that I wouldn't have had exposure to if it weren't for one of these co-collaborative grants that they had to go do this type of team teaching. So I wouldn't recommend it for somebody pre-tenure, but it's super fun and it's super rewarding to do that kind of stuff.
All right, if we don't have any more thoughts on that, maybe I'll move us toward the question that I've saved sort of as our perhaps closing question. And my thoughts was that we could have each of our panelists go around and give their perspective on this question. And then also if there's anything else you would like to add that you feel like maybe we should have asked or touched upon and we didn't, I'd welcome you to add that as well. So here's the question for you. If somebody is interested in learning more about another field outside of their expertise, which I think many people on this call are, what would you suggest that they do to learn more? All right, and let's go ahead and start with Chad.
Wow, I mean, I would say the same way you pursue any passion, right? Which is just try to talk to people about it and read about it. So just to give one quick example, for me, as I became more interested in questions of social justice and trying to use mathematics to study them, I just started reading social justice books, like not math and social justice books, because there aren't that many, right? But I would just go to the bookstore and like see what was on the front table, or go to Amazon and read something by Ibram Kendi, or read like whatever it is. Just like it is a privilege to get to pursue your passions. So just like if you have that privilege, just use it, right? Like just read and talk to people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I would second what Chad said. For me, the different collaborations have sort of started with a conversation with someone. And usually that someone has an expertise that I do not have. And so it's through conversations with them, but also they can recommend, these are the, papers that you have to read, or these are this is the book that you have to read, in order to sort of start learning about the subject. But yeah, I agree. Just talk to people. I sometimes take Coursera courses. I, wanted to learn more about machine learning, and I just took a Coursera course. So, there's so much information that we have access to these days, that, we can learn everything. We just need to have, be willing to put the time into it. But, anything that you want to learn, like, there's so many resources.
Yeah, I agree with what both Nancy and Chad have said. And again, going back to my original point of just being bold, a personal story is I just saw that some people on my timeline had liked someone's post about starting a Zoom writing group. And I figured that it would be this huge, Zoom writing group of like 40 people and whatever. And it ended up being like 4 or 5 women in criminal justice and criminology that all meet up on Zoom every day from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. and check in at the top of the hour about how their progress is going. And I've now got this new network of people that I never would have met before because I liked a tweet and replied to it and said I'd be interested. So absolutely be bold, ask questions, and also don't let your ego get in the way. It's easy when you go into a new field to be like, my expertise is what matters here. If we're going into this collaboration, it's about my methods, it's about my models. But these people are the experts in their own field as well. So have a lot of respect for the people that you're working with and the expertise that they have. And also if you're working in, some more of these sociological realms, actually think about the people who are involved in these societies that are being impacted. Read actual testimonials of people who are in these communities that you're working on, because you're going to learn far more about the people who are on the ground working there rather than the academics who have been writing papers from 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, I guess I want to echo most of what's been said. In a way, I think of this question very similar to when a student comes to me and is at the beginning stages of a research project and is just trying to figure out how to phrase that solid, perfect research question, or how to pinpoint what the project is about. And I will just tell them to go read, read everything you can get your hands on and learn how to process stuff without reading every word, obviously, which is a skill that for most people comes in as, grad school or undergrad. But, and don't force yourself to just read articles or books on that singular topic that you're interested in, but read anything that interests you. Sometimes it's the tertiary stuff that is not obviously related to the area of research that you're interested in that provides the most insight, because it's a different kind of perspective. Anything that you can do that helps your brain make those neural connections between these different fields that you get exposed to, I think expands the way that you can phrase a great research question. Then making sure you stay focused on that curiosity. I think that's the ultimate part of success of anything that we put out there, any type of contributions that we're making to the world in academia or in public scholarship or whatever it might be, focusing on the research question or the curiosity about how we can take a little bit about what we know or what perspective what we have and use that to shine a light on something that other people may also find interesting, I think is a good place to keep our focus.
Can I just say one last thing that Shelby made me think? Just one thing that actually one of my New Year's resolution is to not be afraid to be a beginner. And when we're learning, sometimes we've sort of are at a level where we've mastered something, right? This is what we're good at. And it can be very difficult to be a student again, right? To be the one who doesn't know anything. And it could be humbling. And I think that, just being okay with that can really help you learn something new.
Well, thank you all for these amazing and thoughtful responses. I feel like I've learned so much from this panel, so I really, really appreciate all your time and willingness to be here. So I support that we all thank our panelists virtually in whatever way feels best to you. Say hello in the chat, give them an applause from your home. Thank you so much. And is there anything else any of my co-organizers would like to add in terms of announcements? All right, if not, my final announcement is we didn't get to all the questions today, we'll save them, we'll put them on the Slack. Please respond to the poll. You can find it in the Slack or in the chat today. That would really be helpful for us. And the Slack will stay live. So even though the formal part of this short course is quickly coming to an end, we hope that all of this exciting discussion will be continuing on the Slack and moving forward, that we'll all be able to use this as a starting point. So we really appreciate you all being here and being so engaged and wonderful as an audience. And hopefully we'll all be able to maybe see each other in person again one day in the future. So thanks all. Enjoy.